Most people think of night shift work as quiet, repetitive, and uneventful. The world slows down after midnight. Office is empty. Streets go still. For the people who work through those hours, the job usually becomes about routines, checking the same things, walking the same paths, passing the time until morning. It's supposed to be predictable, safe, in its own dull way. But being awake while everyone else sleeps has a way of changing how normal places feel, even when nothing is obviously wrong. I took the night shift because it paid a little better and because I liked being left alone. The building was an office complex on the edge of town, mostly empty at night except for a few cleaning crews that came and went. My job was simple: security patrol. Clock in at 10, walk the floors every hour, watch the cameras in between, and log anything unusual. Most nights, there was nothing to log. The place was older, built sometime in the late 70s, with long carpeted hallways and low ceilings that made everything feel closer together than it really was. During the day, it was loud and busy. At night, it felt hollow. The air conditioning stayed on, so there was always a faint hum, and the fluorescent lights never fully stopped flickering, even though they were supposed to be new. I followed the same routine every shift. First walk through right after clocking in. Start on the ground floor, then work my way up using the stairwell. I avoided the elevator unless I was tired. The stairs were faster and I liked knowing exactly where I was at all times. Each floor smelled slightly different. Cleaning chemicals on 2, old paper and dust on 4. Something metallic on 6 that I never quite figured out. By midnight, I'd usually be settled in the security office with my coffee, watching the camera feeds. There were over 30 of them, most showing empty hallways, locked doors, and parking lots with the occasional car passing on the road outside. The monitors gave off a soft glow that made it easy to lose track of time. Nothing ever happened during those early hours. Occasionally, a motion sensor would trip because a cleaning cart rolled past too fast, or a door wouldn't latch properly and needed to be checked. It was boring in a way that felt almost comforting. I got used to the silence. I got used to being the only one awake. By the time my second patrol came around 1 in the morning, my body was already moving on autopilot. Same footsteps, same corners, same pauses at the same windows to glance out into the dark parking lot below. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I wasn't expecting anything. It was just another night, exactly like all the others. It was during one of those early patrols that something small stood out, though I didn't think of it as important at the time. I was on the 4th floor, halfway down the east hallway, when I noticed one of the office doors wasn't sitting quite right. It was closed, but the latch hadn't fully caught. The door rested a fraction of an inch open, just enough to break the straight line of the hallway. That wasn't unusual by itself. People were careless when they left for the day. Doors didn't always shut properly. Still, I paused and pushed it closed with 2 fingers until I heard the soft click. I made a mental note to mention it in the log later and kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound, like fabric brushing against carpet. I stopped without meaning to and listened. The hallway was empty. The lights buzzed overhead. The sound didn't repeat. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I normally would, then told myself it was nothing. Buildings made noise at night. Heating systems shifted. Old structures settled. I'd been working there long enough to know that. When I finished the floor and headed for the stairwell, I glanced back down the hallway out of habit. The same door I'd closed earlier was slightly open again. That gave me a brief sense of irritation more than anything else. I walked back, pushed it shut a second time, and tested the handle to make sure it caught. It did. Solid. No resistance. I even tugged it once, just to be sure. On the stairs, I tried to replay my steps to see if I'd missed something. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way the first time. Maybe air pressure from another door had pulled it open. The explanations came easily, and I accepted them without much thought. Back in the security office, I poured more coffee and glanced at the monitors. Everything looked normal. The 4th floor hallway camera showed empty carpet and closed doors lined up evenly on both sides. No movement, no shadows. I logged the loose door and forgot about it. For the rest of that hour, nothing else stood out. No alarms, no noises, no strange camera feeds. The building felt the same as it always did. Quiet, predictable, almost dull. If I'd known that small things like that didn't usually happen just once, I might have paid more attention. But at the time, it barely registered as anything worth remembering. By the 3rd patrol of the night, I was already thinking about how much time was left on my shift. My legs felt heavier, my coffee had gone cold, and the building seemed even quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that made your own footsteps sound too loud, like you were interrupting something. I took the stairs up again, same route as always. When I reached the 4th floor, I slowed without realizing it. I told myself it was habit, that I was just being thorough. Still, my eyes went straight to the east hallway. Halfway down, the same door was open. This time, it wasn't just cracked. It stood open wide enough that I could see into the darkened office beyond. Desks sat in rows, their monitors black, chairs pushed in neatly. Nothing looked disturbed, no papers on the floor, no signs anyone had been there after hours. I felt a brief flicker of annoyance. Someone from cleaning must have forgotten to shut it properly. That was the easiest explanation, and I held on to it. I stepped inside, flicked on the light, and did a quick glance around. Everything was exactly where it should be. When I closed the door, I stood there for a moment longer than before, hand still on the handle. I listened. The office was silent. No breathing, no movement, just the faint hum of electricity from the ceiling lights. I tested the latch again. Solid. The rest of the patrol went normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the floor was paying attention to me. Every sound seemed sharper. The buzz of the lights felt louder. My own breathing sounded uneven in my ears. Back in the security office, I checked the camera feed for that hallway more closely. I rewound the footage to earlier in the night. The door was closed. I skipped forward in time, watching the digital timestamp crawl by. At 1:47 a.m., the door opened. Not all at once. It moved slowly, just enough to break the line of the frame. There was no visible hand, no shadow passing in front of it. It simply opened, inch by inch, until it rested where I'd found it. I stared at the screen, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The door stayed open. The hallway remained empty. I told myself there had to be a pressure issue. Maybe the air system kicked on. Maybe the building settled in some odd way. I'd seen stranger mechanical glitches before. I wrote another note in the log, keeping the wording casual, and tried not to dwell on it. But when I went up again near 3 in the morning, I already knew what I was going to find. The door was open. By then, I stopped feeling annoyed and started feeling tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I didn't rush to the door this time. I stood at the end of the hallway and looked at it from a distance, as if that might change something. The lights were all on. Nothing else was out of place. Just that one office, open again, like it had never been closed at all. I thought about calling it in, but I didn't know what I would say. A door keeps opening on its own didn't sound like anything worth bothering someone over. There were no alarms. No signs of a break-in. No reason I could point to that didn't make me sound like I was grasping at nothing, so I walked down the hallway. Each step felt deliberate, like I was moving slower than usual without meaning to. When I reached the doorway, I didn't go inside right away. I stood just outside and listened. There was a sound coming from the office, very faint. A soft, irregular noise like someone shifting their weight or adjusting their position in a chair. It stopped the moment I focused on it. I waited. Nothing happened. I stepped inside and turned on the light, even though it was already bright enough to see. The room looked the same as before. Empty desks, blank screens, chairs pushed in. No sign anyone had been there. As I checked the corners, I became aware of how enclosed the space felt. The walls seemed closer than they should have. The hum of the lights felt louder, pressing in on my thoughts. When I backed out of the office, I closed the door and stayed there staring at it. My hand lingered on the handle longer than necessary. I didn't test it this time. I didn't want to. On the walk back to the stairwell, I had the uncomfortable sense that something behind me was settling back into place, like I'd interrupted a routine that had nothing to do with my patrol. In the security office, I pulled up the camera feed again, but I didn't rewind it. I just watched it live, eyes fixed on that section of hallway. The door stayed closed. The frame stayed empty. That should have been reassuring. Instead, I felt like I was waiting for something I couldn't see, certain that the moment I looked away, the door would open again. The door didn't open again while I was watching it. My shift ended just before dawn, and I stayed in the security office longer than I needed to, waiting for the daylight to fully settle in through the windows. When I finally did one last patrol before leaving, I avoided the 4th floor entirely. I told myself I was saving time. That it didn't matter. But my steps took a different route without me consciously deciding it. I logged out and went home, trying not to think about the night as anything more than a minor inconvenience. Doors malfunctioned, buildings were old. Night shifts messed with your head. Those explanations were easy when the sun was up. I worked the next night anyway. Everything was normal at first. Same routine, same quiet. When my first patrol took me past the 4th floor, I slowed automatically. The hallway was empty. All the doors were closed. I didn't check the office. By the 3rd night, I started timing my patrols so that I passed through that area as quickly as possible. I stopped reviewing the camera footage for that hallway unless I absolutely had to. The logs stayed vague. I avoided writing anything specific that would force me to think about it too much. Nothing else ever happened. No alarms, no noises, no doors opening while I was watching. But every night when I reached the stairwell near the fourth floor, I felt that same tight awareness settle in. The sense that something was waiting for me to leave it alone. Like the building had its own habits and I was never meant to interfere with them. After a few weeks, I asked to be moved to a different site. I didn't explain why. I didn't try to justify it. I just stopped walking those halls. Even now, years later, I still catch myself watching doors after I close them, waiting to see if they'll move when I turn away. The night shift at the hospital wasn't something people usually asked for. Most nurses preferred day hours when there were more staff around and the work felt less isolating. I took nights because it fit my schedule and because, for the most part, it was quieter, fewer visitors, fewer interruptions, just long stretches of routine care in dimly lit hallways. I worked on a medical floor that stayed half full at best. Many of the rooms were used for short stays or observation, so patients came and went quickly. By midnight, most of them were asleep. The overhead lights were dimmed, and the floor settled into a steady rhythm of monitors beeping and machines cycling on and off. My tasks were predictable. Check vitals every few hours, refill water pitchers, answer call buttons when they lit up. Walk the same loop from room to room, clipboard in hand, shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. There was a long hallway that ran past the nurses' station, with patient rooms on one side and supply closets on the other. At the far end was a door that led to a service corridor. Most of us didn't use unless we had to. It was quieter down there, and the lights were always a little dimmer than the rest of the floor. Around 1 in the morning, things slowed even more. The charge nurse did rounds, the aides took their breaks, and I usually found myself alone for a while. I didn't mind it. The silence felt controlled, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I knew most of the patients by name. I knew which rooms needed extra attention and which ones would stay quiet until morning. There was comfort in that familiarity, in knowing what to expect. That night didn't feel different when it started. Nothing stood out. No unusual admissions. No tense conversations. Just another shift to get through, hour by hour, until the sun came up and someone else took over. It was a call light that first pulled my attention toward the end of the hallway. Room 3018, one of the observation rooms. The light blinked steadily on the panel above the door, not urgent, just the standard request signal. I checked my notes as I walked. The patient in that room had been admitted earlier for monitoring. Stable. Alert. No reason they should need anything unexpected. When I stepped inside, the room was quiet. The patient was asleep, turned slightly toward the window, breathing slow and even. The call button rested on the bed rail untouched. I stood there for a moment, confused, then reached over and canceled the light. Sometimes patients hit the button in their sleep. It wasn't uncommon. I adjusted the blanket and left without waking them. 10 minutes later, the same light came on again. This time, I felt a small pinch of irritation. I walked back down the hallway, already rehearsing what I'd say if the patient needed reassurance or water. But again, the room was exactly the same. The patient hadn't moved. The call button hadn't shifted. I checked the cord, thinking it might be faulty. It looked fine. No fraying. No tension. I reset the panel and stepped back into the hallway. At the nurse's station, I mentioned it casually to the aide on duty. She shrugged and said some of the older buttons were sensitive. The explanation was enough. Hospitals were full of equipment that behaved oddly without meaning anything by it. Later, as I finished another round of vitals, the light came on a third time. I didn't go right away. I waited at the station, watching the indicator, half expecting it to shut off on its own. It didn't. It stayed lit, steady and patient, like it was meant to. When I finally went back into the room, the patient was awake, staring at the ceiling. They looked at me when I entered, eyes unfocused but alert. "Did you need something?" I asked quietly. They shook their head. "No," they said. I didn't call anyone. I turned the light off again and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, trying to decide why that answer unsettled me more than it should have. After that, I started paying more attention to the panel at the nurse's station. Room 3018 stayed dark for a while, long enough that I convinced myself the issue had resolved on its own. Equipment glitches came and went. That was normal. Then, just after 2 in the morning, the light came on again. I watched it from across the station, waiting for it to flicker or shut off. It didn't. I checked the patient list, even though I already knew there were no scheduled checks for that room at that time. I told myself I'd give it a minute. Sometimes patients hit the button and change their minds. When I went back in, the patient was sitting up slightly, hands folded on the blanket. They looked at me as soon as I stepped inside. "I didn't press it," they said before I could ask. I nodded and reached for the panel anyway, resetting it with a practiced motion. My hand lingered there longer than usual. I glanced at the call button again, then at the cord leading down the side of the bed. Nothing about it looked disturbed. As I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't before. The bathroom door in the room was open. I was sure it had been closed earlier. I made a habit of keeping them shut unless a patient needed assistance. I stood there, trying to picture myself opening it and forgetting. The memory didn't come. "Did you go to the bathroom?" I asked. The patient shook their head. "No." I checked it anyway. The light was off. The room was empty. I closed the door and stepped back out. Over the next hour, the call light activated twice more. Both times, I went in to find the patient still, watching, and insistent that they hadn't touched the button. The bathroom door was open again the second time, though I remembered closing it. I didn't write anything about it in the chart. I told myself I was overthinking. Fatigue made small inconsistencies feel larger than they were. Still, I found myself walking faster when I left that room, aware of the space behind me in a way I hadn't been before. By the middle of the night, I stopped reacting to the call light with surprise and started reacting with a dull, creeping tension. Every time it turned on, my shoulders tightened before I even stood up. I noticed something else then, something harder to dismiss. The light never activated while I was in the room. It only came on after I left. I tried to test it. After the next check, I stood just outside the door, pretending to review notes on my clipboard. The hallway was empty. The floor was quiet. After a few seconds, the panel above the door lit up. I went back inside immediately. The patient looked at me, expression unreadable. "I didn't do anything," they said. "I believed them." The bathroom door was open again. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with stress or exhaustion. I closed the door more firmly this time and stayed in the room longer, watching, listening. Nothing happened. The call button stayed dark. When I finally stepped out, I stood at the station and watched the panel from a distance. I didn't look away. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the light came on again. No sound, no flicker, just on. I realized then that I was timing it, counting the seconds between my exit and the light activating. It was always just long enough for me to be out of sight. I couldn't explain why that detail mattered so much, but it did. It felt deliberate, like the room was responding to absence rather than presence. I stopped checking the bathroom unless I absolutely had to. I stopped reassuring myself with explanations. The floor felt less controlled now, the quiet less neutral. The hallway seemed longer, the lights dimmer. Every time I walked away from room 38, I felt like I was leaving something alone that preferred it that way. Near the end of the shift, I handed off my patients without mentioning room 318. I didn't want to explain it, and I didn't want to hear it explained away. The room stayed quiet for the rest of the night, the call light dark, the door closed when morning staff arrived. I came back the following night and checked the assignment board as soon as I clocked in. Room 318 was still occupied. Same patient. I adjusted my route so I passed the room less often. When the call light came on, I answered it quickly, almost automatically, before I could think about timing or patterns. Each time, the patient denied touching the button. Each time, the bathroom door was open when I entered. Eventually, I stopped closing it. I didn't know why that felt safer, only that it did. The rest of the floor stayed calm. Other patients slept. Other call lights behaved the way they were supposed to. Nothing else followed that same rhythm of waiting for me to leave. A few nights later, room 318 was empty. The patient had been discharged without incident. The bed was stripped, the monitors unplugged, the door propped open for cleaning. I still avoided looking inside when I walked past. Even now, when a call light goes on just after I step away from a room, I feel that same pause before I turn around. I don't wait to see if it shuts off on its own anymore. I don't assume it's a mistake. I answer it, and I keep the door open behind me. The night shift at the transit depot was quieter than most people imagined. By the time I clocked in, the last buses were already rolling back in from their routes, engines ticking as they cooled. The building sat on the edge of an industrial area, surrounded by chain-link fencing and empty lots that went dark early. My job was maintenance support. I wasn't fixing anything major overnight, just monitoring systems, logging issues, and responding if something failed. Most of the work happened during the day. Nights were about keeping things stable until morning. The depot itself was a wide, open structure with high ceilings and long concrete corridors that connected the garages, offices, and storage rooms. Sounds carried farther at night. A dropped tool echoed. A closing door felt louder than it should have. I had a desk in a small control room with windows that looked out onto the main garage. Rows of parked buses sat in the dim light, their interiors dark, their shapes barely distinguishable beyond the glass. Security cameras covered the exterior and most of the interior spaces, though there were a few blind spots where older equipment hadn't been updated. My routine rarely changed. I did a walkthrough at the start of the shift, checked the logs from the previous day, then settled in with paperwork and screens. Every couple of hours, I'd walk the perimeter again, mostly to stay awake. There was a break room down one of the longer corridors that stayed open all night. A vending machine, a table, a few plastic chairs. I passed it often but rarely stopped unless I needed coffee. Past that was a storage area I almost never went into. It wasn't off limits, it just wasn't part of my route. That night felt ordinary when it began. No delays, no maintenance alerts, just the steady hum of the building and the sense of being one of the few people left awake in a place built for constant movement. It started with a noise I couldn't place. I was in the control room filling out a routine log when I heard something echo down the corridor outside. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming. Just a dull, hollow sound, like something being shifted across concrete. It lasted only a second or two, then stopped. I listened, pen hovering above the paper. The depot settled back into its usual background hum. Ventilation systems, distant traffic, nothing else. I told myself it was probably one of the buses cooling down. Metal expanded and contracted all the time. The building was full of sounds that didn't mean anything. Later, during my next walkthrough, I passed the break room and noticed the vending machine light was off. That was unusual. It stayed on all night. I stopped and pressed one of the buttons. The lights flickered back on, buzzing softly. I hadn't written that down yet when I heard the sound again. This time it came from farther down the corridor, closer to the storage area I didn't usually check. It sounded like a door being nudged, not opening fully, just enough to move. I slowed my pace but didn't change direction. There was no reason to. If someone else was on site, they would have checked in. The logs didn't show any late maintenance scheduled. When I reached the end of the corridor, everything looked the same as always. The storage room door was closed. The handle sat straight. No light spilled from underneath. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. On the way back, I glanced over my shoulder once just to be sure. The corridor was empty. The vending machine light glowed steadily behind me. By the time I returned to the control room, I'd already filed the noise away as nothing worth thinking about, but I found myself turning the volume up slightly on the cameras, listening harder than I usually did, without being able to explain why. The sound came back an hour later. I was watching the camera feeds when I heard it through the open doorway of the control room, clearer this time. A dragging noise, slow and uneven, like something heavy being pulled a short distance and then left to rest. It didn't echo as much as before. It felt closer. I muted the monitor audio and listened directly. The noise stopped almost immediately, as if it had never been there to begin with. I checked the cameras that covered the corridor. The feed showed an empty stretch of concrete floor, doors closed on both sides. No movement, no flicker. I rewound a few minutes and watched again. Nothing appeared on the screen that matched what I'd heard. During my next walkthrough, I changed my route without meaning to. I still walked the corridor, but I slowed near the storage area, listening for anything out of place. The air felt cooler there, heavier, and the overhead lights buzzed more sharply. The storage room door was still closed, but the handle was turned slightly downward, like it hadn't settled back into place properly. I stared at it, trying to decide if that was how it always looked. I couldn't remember. I reached out and nudged it. The handle lifted back into position with a soft click. I didn't open the door. As I walked away, I heard the dragging sound again, faint but unmistakable. This time, it came from behind me. I stopped mid-step, heart beating harder than it should have. The corridor behind me was empty. The sound didn't repeat. I waited anyway, counting under my breath until the silence felt stable again. Back in the control room, I made a note about unusual noises, keeping it vague. I told myself I'd check it properly later, maybe with someone else around. But as the night went on, I noticed a pattern forming. The sounds only happened when I wasn't looking at the cameras, only when I was physically present somewhere else in the building. Once I realized that, I stopped replaying the footage altogether. By the middle of the shift, I stopped moving through the depot the way I normally did. Every decision felt weighed down by awareness. I lingered in doorways. I paused at corners. I listened longer than necessary before taking another step. The sounds didn't happen often, but when they did, they felt placed. Always just out of sight. Always far enough away that I couldn't point to an exact source. I forced myself to do another walkthrough, telling myself that avoiding parts of the building would only make things worse. When I reached the corridor near the storage area, the air felt different again. Still, pressed. The storage room door was open, only a few inches, just enough to break the line of the wall. I stopped several feet away. The space beyond the door was dark, deeper than it should have been with the hallway lights on. I couldn't see anything inside, not even the outlines of shelves I knew were there. I waited for a sound. Nothing came. I told myself someone might have gone in earlier and forgotten to close it. That explanation didn't feel solid, but it was all I had. I stepped forward and pushed the door shut. It resisted slightly, like something on the other side was leaning against it. Not enough to stop me, just enough to register. When the door finally closed, the latch clicked louder than usual. I stood there with my hand still on the handle, listening. Behind me, somewhere in the depot, something scraped across the floor. I didn't turn around. I walked back to the control room without looking at the cameras, without checking the logs, without trying to confirm anything. The building felt larger now, stretched out, full of spaces I couldn't see at once. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the control room with the door closed, listening to every sound the depot made and trying not to imagine what was adjusting itself whenever I wasn't watching. The rest of the shift passed without another sound I could clearly point to. No dragging, no scraping, just the low, constant hum of the depot doing what it always did. That almost felt worse, like the building had decided it didn't need to test me anymore. When morning came, I left without doing my final walkthrough. I signed out, handed over my notes, and didn't mention the storage room. I didn't know how to explain it without making it sound smaller than it felt. I worked a few more night shifts after that. The sounds never came back in the same way. The corridor stayed quiet, the storage room door stayed closed, the cameras never showed anything unusual. But I stopped walking that route altogether. I rearranged my checks so I could see the corridor from a distance without passing through it. I kept the control room door shut. I stayed where the cameras overlapped, where I could see as much of the building as possible at once. Eventually, I asked to be moved to day shifts. I said I was having trouble sleeping. That part was true. Nights had started to feel too open, like the building had more room to move when fewer people were around. Even now, when I hear something drag across a hard floor and stop just before it comes into view, I don't look toward the sound. I wait for it to stop moving first. The night shift at the radio station was supposed to be the easiest job I'd ever had. After midnight, there were no guests, no live interviews, no phone calls coming in, just preloaded playlists, automated segments, and a quiet building to sit in until morning. The station occupied the second floor of a small commercial building downtown. During the day, it was busy and loud. At night, it felt sealed off from the rest of the city. The elevator shut down after hours, so anyone working late used the stairs. Once you were inside, there was no reason to leave unless something went wrong. My role was simple: monitor the broadcast, make sure nothing cut out, and step in if the automation failed. Most of the time, it didn't. I spent the hours watching levels, checking timestamps, and letting the music play through empty streets. The studio lights were dimmed overnight, just enough to see the boards and screens. The hall outside the control room stayed dark except for emergency lighting. Offices lined the corridor, their doors shut, their windows black. There was a second studio farther down the hall that wasn't used anymore. Old equipment, outdated wiring. It stayed locked and no one went in unless maintenance needed access. I passed it every shift without thinking about it. Around 1 in the morning, the building settled into a steady quiet. The music looped smoothly. The broadcast clock stayed on track. Nothing demanded my attention. That night felt no different when it started. No glitches, no alerts, just the familiar isolation of staying awake while the rest of the city slept. Listening to sound meant for people who weren't there. The first thing that felt off wasn't something I heard. It was something I saw on the board. One of the inactive channels flickered. It wasn't part of the broadcast mix. It shouldn't have been showing any input at all. The level bar jumped once, just a thin green line, then went still again. I leaned closer, watching the meters. Everything else stayed steady. The broadcast channel was clean, no distortion, no unexpected noise in my headphones. I told myself it was electrical interference. The building was old. The wiring had been patched and repatched over the years. Small glitches happened. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, the bar jumped higher. Just for a second. Still no sound. I muted the channel manually, even though it wasn't routed anywhere, and waited. The hallway outside the control room felt quieter than usual. No distant traffic noise. No movement from other floors. Just the low hum of equipment and the faint hiss of air through the vents. I checked the channel list. The input was labeled for the unused studio down the hall. I stared at the name longer than I needed to. The door to that studio was supposed to be locked. There was no scheduled work, no reason for anything to be feeding into that channel. I considered getting up and checking, then decided against it. If there was a wiring issue, it could wait until morning. Nothing was affecting the broadcast. The meter jumped again. This time, it didn't drop right away. It hovered, faint but steady, as if something was holding the line open. I sat very still, listening through the headphones, even though the channel was muted, aware of the space behind me in a way that had nothing to do with sound. After that, I couldn't stop watching the meters. The inactive channel pulsed at irregular intervals. Sometimes the line barely moved. Other times it spiked high enough that it would have been audible if it was live. Still, nothing came through my headphones. Just silence. I double-checked the routing to make sure nothing was feeding into the broadcast by mistake. Everything was clean. The channel was isolated. I told myself I could leave it alone. Let engineering deal with it later. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore. The activity wasn't random. It had a rhythm, uneven but deliberate, like something testing the line. I took my headphones off and listened to the room instead. The equipment racks hummed steadily. The air vent above me whispered. From the hallway, I thought I heard a soft click, like a door settling back into place. I didn't get up to check. When I looked back at the board, the inactive channel was maxed out. The meter slammed into the red and stayed there. I froze, staring at it, waiting for an alarm or some kind of audible feedback. Nothing happened. The broadcast stayed smooth. The music continued uninterrupted. Slowly, the meter dropped back down to 0. My heart didn't. I stood up then, more out of reflex than intention, and opened the control room door just enough to look into the hallway. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the floor. Every office door was closed. At the far end, the door to the unused studio was no longer flush with the frame, but it was slightly open. I stood there longer than I meant to, hand resting on the edge of the door frame, staring down the hallway. The open studio door didn't move. It didn't creak wider or swing shut. It just stayed exactly as it was, like it had been left that way on purpose. I told myself someone from engineering must have been in earlier and forgotten to secure it. That explanation felt thin, but it was familiar, and familiarity mattered more than accuracy at that moment. I stepped into the hallway. Each step sounded too loud against the floor, even though I was moving slowly. The emergency lights made everything look flatter, less real. When I reached the studio door, I stopped just short of touching it. Inside, the room was dark. The equipment racks were silhouettes against the faint glow from the hallway. I couldn't hear anything coming from within. No voices, no movement, just the same low hum I'd heard all night. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The lights didn't turn on. That was when I noticed the microphone. It was pulled out of its holder and angled toward the center of the room. The cable trailed across the floor, plugged into the wall panel. Everything else looked untouched. Chairs pushed in. Consoles dark. Just the mic, positioned like someone had stepped away from it mid-use. I didn't go any farther into the room. I reached in, unplugged the cable from the wall, and watched the inactive channel on the board through the control room window drop instantly to 0. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. I closed the studio door and locked it, checking the handle twice. When I went back to the board, I disabled the channel completely and wrote a short note for engineering that didn't explain much. For the rest of the night, I didn't take my eyes off the meters, certain that the moment I stopped watching, something would try to find another way through. Nothing else happened before morning. The inactive channel stayed dead. The meters didn't flicker. The broadcast ran exactly as it was supposed to, right up until the day shift arrived. When I handed things over, I mentioned the equipment issue and left it at that. I didn't stay to hear the explanation. I worked a few more nights after that. The unused studio stayed locked. Engineering replaced the cable, filed the report, and said the signal bleed must have been interference. The explanation sounded complete enough that no one asked questions. I never saw the channel light up again. But I started doing something without realizing it. Every time I spoke on air, even briefly, I watched the board closely. I kept my sentences short. I left longer gaps between words. I avoided dead air. After a while, I noticed that I'd stopped talking to myself entirely during night shifts. No humming, no muttering, just silence unless I had a reason to speak. I transferred out of overnights not long after. I told them I wanted more regular hours. That part was true. Even now, when I see a microphone left out and ready, angled toward an empty room, I make sure it's unplugged before I turn my back on it. The night shift at the motel desk wasn't busy, but it wasn't quiet either. Even after midnight, cars pulled in off the highway, engines ticking as they cooled, headlights sweeping across the parking lot before going dark. Most guests checked in late, slept a few hours, then left before sunrise. I worked alone behind the front desk, separated from the lobby by a low counter and a wall of windows that looked out toward the rooms. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. A small TV played on low volume, mostly to keep me company. My responsibilities were simple. Check guests in and out, answer the phone, do a walk of the property once an hour. Everything else could wait until morning. The motel was laid out in a wide U-shape, 2 floors facing inward toward the parking lot. All the rooms opened directly outside. At night, the overhead lights cast long shadows across the concrete walkways, leaving the corners dim. There were always a few rooms that stayed empty. Sometimes because of maintenance issues, sometimes because guests asked not to be placed there. I never asked why. The system marked them as unavailable, and that was enough. Around 1 in the morning, things usually slowed down. The highway noise softened. The parking lot settled. The lobby felt suspended, like it existed outside normal time. That night started the same way every other one did. No complaints. No unusual guests. Just the steady rhythm of keys sliding across the counter and the quiet expectation that nothing would interrupt the hours until dawn. The first thing I noticed was the keycard. I was sorting through the returns from earlier when I saw one sitting on the counter that I didn't remember checking in. It was face down, the magnetic strip worn smooth from use. I turned it over and saw the room number written in marker, 24. That room wasn't supposed to be occupied. I checked the screen to be sure. The system still listed it as unavailable, same as it had for months. I assumed I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd pulled it from the wrong stack. I set it aside and continued my paperwork. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. The call came from inside the motel. I glanced at the display. Room 214. I stared at it for a second before answering. The line was open, but no one spoke. I could hear faint background noise. Wind, maybe. Or traffic. "Front desk," I said. Nothing. I waited, then hung up. I checked the cameras. The feed that covered the second floor walkway showed empty concrete and closed doors. No movement near 214. The room's light was off. I told myself someone had picked up the phone by accident, maybe a maintenance worker checking something earlier. The explanation felt thin, but it was all I had. I placed the keycard in the drawer under the desk and locked it. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. "Room 214. This time, I didn't answer right away. I watched the display, listening to the ring echo softly through the lobby, and tried to decide what unsettled me more. The call itself, or the certainty that no one should have been in that room to make it. When I finally picked up, the line was quiet again. No voice, no movement, just the same faint sound, steady and distant, like air moving through an open space. I hung up and went back to the computer. Room 214 still showed as unavailable. No check-in, no override, nothing that explained the calls. I tried to convince myself it was a wiring issue. Old buildings had crossed lines, faulty phones, problems that didn't require a person on the other end. Then the phone rang a third time. I answered immediately. Front desk. There was a pause, then a soft click, like someone adjusting the receiver. "I need another key," a voice said. It was calm, flat, not rushed. "For which room?" I asked, even though I already knew. 214. I looked at the screen again, hoping it would change. It didn't. "I can't make a key for that room," I said. "It's not." The line went dead. I stood there, phone still in my hand, listening to the silence. The lobby felt larger, stretched out by the absence of sound. The TV murmured in the background, suddenly too loud. I checked the camera feed again. This time, the walkway outside 214 showed the door slightly open. Just a crack. Enough to let the light from the hallway spill inside. I watched the feed for a full minute. The door didn't move. No one stepped out. No shadow crossed the frame. When the phone rang again, I didn't answer it. I unplugged it from the wall instead. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at the dark screen where the camera feed had been. I'd switched it away from the second floor without thinking, like hiding it would make the room disappear. After a while, I forced myself to look again. The door to 214 was closed now. I hadn't seen it move. I checked the time, nearly 3 in the morning. The motel felt hollow in a way it hadn't earlier, like the space between rooms mattered more than the rooms themselves. I told myself I needed to do a property walk, that avoiding it would only make the rest of the shift feel worse. I grabbed the master key, locked the office, and stepped outside. The night air was cool and still. The overhead lights buzzed softly as I crossed the parking lot and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Each step echoed more than it should have. Room 214 sat at the far end of the walkway. The curtains were drawn. No light showed from inside. I stopped a few doors away and listened. I didn't hear a TV, I didn't hear movement, just the faint hum of traffic beyond the lot. When I reached the door, I noticed the handle was warm. I don't know why that detail stuck with me. It just did. I raised the master key, then hesitated. The idea of opening the door felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like I was about to interrupt something that expected privacy. I stepped back instead. Behind me, somewhere along the walkway, a phone rang. I didn't turn around when I heard it. The ringing was faint, but unmistakable. Not from the office, not from the lobby. It came from somewhere on the second floor, echoing softly between the concrete walls. I walked back the way I'd come, keeping my pace steady, refusing to look toward any of the doors as I passed them. The sound stopped before I reached the stairs. When I got back to the office, the desk phone was still unplugged. The rest of the shift passed without another call. At sunrise, I locked up and left without finishing the last walk. Later that day, I asked the manager about room 214. He didn't look surprised. He just said it stayed unavailable and changed the subject. I never worked another overnight there. Even now, when a phone rings and no one speaks on the other end, I wait a second longer than I should before hanging up. Just in case they're about to ask for another key, I didn't finish that shift the way I normally did. I stayed behind the desk until daylight, watching the parking lot and keeping the office lights on. I didn't turn the phone back on. I didn't check the cameras again. I just waited for morning to arrive and make the building feel occupied again. When the manager came in, I told him I was done with nights. I didn't mention the calls or the key card. I didn't bring up room 214. He nodded like he'd heard it before and didn't ask me to explain. I worked a few more day shifts before I quit entirely. The key card for 24 stayed in the drawer until I left. I never threw it away. I never used it. I didn't want to find out what would happen if I did. Sometimes, when I stay in hotels now, I check the room number twice before I open the door. If the key doesn't work right away, I don't try again. And if the phone rings late at night and no one speaks, I don't wait for them to ask. I hang up and leave the room light on until morning. The night shift at the data center was designed to be uneventful. That was the whole point. Rows of servers ran around the clock, and the people on overnight duty were there mostly to make sure nothing stopped working while the rest of the staff slept. The building sat on the outskirts of town, windowless and quiet, surrounded by fencing and security lights. Inside, everything was controlled: temperature, airflow, access. You didn't wander. You followed marked paths and logged every door you opened. My role was monitoring and response. I watched system dashboards, checked alerts, and did scheduled walkthroughs to make sure nothing was overheating or throwing errors. Most nights, nothing did. The systems were stable, predictable. The server rooms themselves were long and narrow, lined with tall black racks that hummed constantly. The sound was loud but consistent, a white noise that faded into the background once you'd been there long enough. The lights were always on, bright, flat, no shadows. Between checks, I stayed in the control room with a bank of monitors and a small desk. The door locked automatically behind me. If something went wrong, alarms would trigger long before I noticed it myself. I liked the order of it, the sense that everything was accounted for. Every cable had a place, every alert had a cause. That night started like any other. No warnings, no unusual readings. Just another shift, watching systems do exactly what they were built to do, hour after hour, without interruption. The first alert wasn't an alarm. It was a status notification, the kind that usually meant nothing. One of the access logs updated. I glanced at the screen out of habit, expecting to see a routine system check or an automated process ping. Instead, it showed a door cycle in one of the secondary server aisles. Door opened. Door closed. Time-stamped just a few seconds apart. That aisle wasn't scheduled for a walkthrough yet. No maintenance, no reason for anyone to be there. I checked the access ID. It was mine. I frowned and pulled up the camera feed for that section. The aisle was empty. Rows of racks stood exactly as they always did. No movement, no door in frame swinging or settling. I assumed it was a logging error. The system wasn't perfect, rare, but not impossible. I made a mental note and kept watching the dashboards. A few minutes later, the log updated again. Same aisle. Door opened. Door closed. Same ID. I sat back in my chair, suddenly aware of how loud the servers felt around me. I checked my own position. I was still in the control room. The door behind me was shut. I hadn't moved. I pulled up the detailed log view, scanning for anything else out of place. Everything else looked normal. No badge failures, no forced entries, just those two clean, ordinary door cycles. I told myself the badge reader might be misfiring. Maybe it was catching a signal from my card through a wall. The explanation didn't feel solid, but it was the only one that fit. Then, without any alert at all, one of the server aisle lights flicked off on the camera feed. Just one row, going dark. The hum of the building didn't change, but something in me did. As I stared at the empty aisle on the screen and waited for the light to come back on, the light didn't come back on right away. I watched the feed, waiting for the system to correct itself. Motion sensors controlled those lights. They weren't supposed to turn off unless someone left the aisle. Even then, there was a delay. I checked the sensor status. It showed active. I checked the power load for that row. Normal, no fluctuation, nothing that explained why the lights were out. Then the access log updated again. Same aisle. Door opened. Door closed. Same ID. I felt a slow, crawling awareness settle in as I realized the timestamps were lining up with the lights. Every time the log updated, something changed on the camera feed. Not always something obvious. Sometimes it was just a slight shift in contrast, like the camera was adjusting to movement that wasn't there. I zoomed in on the dark aisle. The racks were still visible in the emergency glow from adjacent rows. The door at the end was shut. No shadows crossed the frame. I stood up and checked the control room door behind me. Locked. I was alone. When I sat back down, another aisle light went out on the same row, further down. The darkness crept inward, one section at a time, slow enough to watch. I pulled up the full access history. The entries were stacking now. Clean. Identical. All under my name. I told myself the safest thing was to stay where I was. Let the system stabilize. Let morning staff handle it. That was when the log showed a door opening much closer. Control room access. My ID. The door behind me didn't move. I stayed still, staring at the control room door, waiting for it to react to the log entry. It didn't unlock. It didn't click. The handle didn't turn. The system said it had opened and closed anyway. I checked the camera that covered the hallway outside the control room. The feed showed an empty stretch of floor, lit the same way it always was. No one standing there, no door in motion. The access log updated again. Control room, open, close. I felt the need to account for myself, like the system had lost track of where I was. I checked in mentally. Chair, desk, monitors, locked door. Everything exactly where it should be. Another aisle light went out on the camera feed. I realized then that the pattern wasn't random. The system wasn't glitching all at once. It was moving inward, from the far aisles toward me, logging presence where there was none, turning off lights as if something was passing through. I opened the building map and watched the access points highlight one by one as new entries appeared, each one closer to the control room than the last. I stopped trying to explain it. I sent a brief message to the on-call supervisor, keeping it technical. Access log anomalies, lighting inconsistency. Requested review. I didn't add anything else. When I looked back at the cameras, the aisle outside the control room was dark. The emergency lights hadn't come on. The camera still worked. I could see the outline of the door, the handle, the wall. Just not the space between. Another log entry appeared. Control room, open. I didn't wait for it to close. I stood up and backed away from the door, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The handle stayed still. The lock indicator never changed. The system insisted the door was opening anyway, over and over, like it was trying to convince itself. I grabbed my phone and called security. The call connected, but no one answered. Just the faint hiss of an open line. On the monitors, the access map lit up again. Control room. Open. Close. Then the lights inside the control room went out. Not all at once. The overhead panels shut off in sections, the way the aisle lights had. Bright to dim to dark. The monitors stayed on, glowing too brightly in the sudden darkness. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the door. I stayed where I was, watching the screens as the system continued to log activity that wasn't happening. The last entry appeared without a sound. Control room, occupied. That was when I realized the logs weren't tracking where I was going. They were tracking where I wasn't anymore. Morning staff found me sitting at the desk with all the lights on and every alert acknowledged. I told them the systems had stabilized on their own. I didn't mention the logs. Later, when I checked my access history, it showed a clean shift. No anomalies, no extra entries, just one normal door cycle at the end of the night. My exit. I don't work nights anymore, and I don't badge into places unless I can see the door open with my own eyes. I didn't stay after that. I logged out at the end of the shift and left without waiting for anyone to relieve me. I didn't try to explain why. I didn't write anything extra in the report. I walked out while the building was still bright and occupied, before the systems could settle back into their normal patterns. Later that day, I checked my access history again from home. It showed a clean timeline. No phantom entries, no control room logs repeating my name. Just the single exit badge and nothing else out of place. When I went back in for my next scheduled night, I stood in the parking lot for a long time before going inside. The building looked the same, quiet, windowless, controlled. I couldn't tell where the server rooms ended and where I began. I asked to be moved to days. On the day shift, everything behaved the way it was supposed to. Lights stayed on, logs matched reality, doors only opened when I was standing in front of them. No one questioned the transfer. But I noticed something I couldn't stop noticing. Every system assumed presence by absence. Motion sensors waited for something to leave. Logs recorded what passed through, not what stayed. The infrastructure didn't need a person to understand occupancy, it just needed patterns. Now, when an access log updates, I always check the camera first. I don't trust the entry on its own. I don't trust my name on a screen unless I can see myself standing there, and when a system insists a space is occupied while everything in it is still, I don't try to correct it. I step away, because whatever moved through that building that night didn't force its way in. It just filled the gap where I stopped being accounted for.